Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe, and especially in Tbilisi. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a very good event for you this morning in Washington on the disturbing events that are happening in the country of Georgia. And to discuss this with us, we have Ambassador Dan Fried, who's the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow. We have Michael Cesare, who's a Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. We have Ambassador Shotik Veneria, who's a non-resident fellow at the Economic Policy Research Center. We have David Kramer, the Executive Center Director of the George W. Bush Institute. And we have Laura Lindemann, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council, who perhaps knows more about any living American in Washington right now. So we will turn straight away to our conversation. And the first question will be to Shota. The Georgian government's comparing the foreign agent law that produced all these demonstrations to U.S. FARA legislation. Others see it like the Kremlin law to hobble non-government organizations. Please describe the Georgian legislation and the reaction thus far to its passage.
Well, thank you very much for putting this event together. It is extremely important to get the word out of Tbilisi now and really alarm and alert people on what is going on there. But I hope we'll have a chance to talk about this wider context a little bit more. But now to your question, well, there are two things. First, the context is absolutely crucial here. And the understanding that the ruling party of Georgia has been gradually moving from this pretending to be a pro-Western power and having that huge gap in the between the narrative and the policy to now being a pro-Russian, anti-Western power openly. And Ukraine was a litmus test for them in this. They failed to support Ukraine. They openly say that actually the West is trying to drag Georgia into the war, so they align themselves fully with Russian propaganda. So everything they say and everything they do is the clear demonstration that these people are in the Russian orbit. They're not intending even or willing to bring this country closer to West. And then in this context, of course, initiating this legislation, which is undoubtedly aimed at silencing the critical voice in Georgia and the vibrant civil society and the free media, which still it makes Georgia different from, let's say, Belarus. You know, this is why Georgia's democracy is still standing, because we still have the civil society and the critical media. And this law that was initiated is exactly aimed at this target. And the difference with FARA, there are a lot of differences apart from this political and geopolitical context. But one big fundamental difference is that in FARA, it's very clearly stated which is the state, adversarial state or the enemy state whose influences should be actually reduced or controlled through this legislation, and who is the friendly country that whose funding should be excluded from such a legislation. That's one. And the second is, of course, that in contrast to FARA, the Georgian version or the Russian version of the law that was initiated in Parliament of Georgia directly targets all the individuals, CSOs and NGOs, as well as the media outlets, and not the lobbyist organizations that are actually representing the interests of the foreign state or foreign government, as in FARA's case. So I would outline that, yes, the intention of the legislation is different. The target group for the legislation is different. And of course, the thing that the law in Georgia does not specify Russia as the occupying force, and most of the pro-Russian organizations will not fall under this legislation because they do not have this transparent funding mechanisms, in contrast to the Western ones, makes a huge difference in my opinion.
That's a very important point. Thank you, Shota. Okay, Michael, observers, including Georgia's friends in Washington, have been complaining about backsliding on democracy for years. Notably, the EU did not offer Tbilisi talks on membership when it invited Kiev and Chisinau to such talks. Please describe the backdrop to this latest crisis, the context that Shota referred to.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador, and glad to be with everyone here today, despite the alarming circumstances of this discussion. In terms of a backdrop, I would say that we have to look at a few things. One is the clear evidence of backsliding democratic institutions and political practices in Georgia. This has been on, I think, full display, particularly since around the 2018 period, and in some respects even further than that. We see evidence of increasing and compounding use of an abuse of administrative resources when it comes to elections and political campaigning, the kind of merging of the Georgian Dream ruling party and the state. That has been a recurring issue in Georgia for many years, but it's been certainly made more acute in the last few years in this government. Also, the gutting of the judiciary, the removal of any sort of pretense to its independence, that has been an assault that has been ongoing for quite a while. And again, this has been a compounding issue and one that has only gotten worse over time. And in fact, we don't need to look very far at just the kind of visceral reaction from the ruling party or elements of the ruling party leadership in response to U.S. and EU urging that Georgia protect its obligations to a free and independent judiciary, and this has been a problem for quite some time. And also, I think many people who are watching here know there has been a problem throughout the Georgian Dream tenure with the jailing of political opponents on various trumped-up charges. Sometimes these are people who may have actually had some role in criminality in the past. Maybe sometimes they haven't. Sometimes the charges stuck. Sometimes they were actually quite flimsy. But it was often selective. It was often in the absence of due process, and it was often done in a way that in a rhetorical context that seems to suggest politically motivated attacks, even among those for whom there was maybe some legitimate, criminality to be pursued. So there was kind of a weaponization again of the judiciary, the merging of the party and the state, and a kind of personalization of the state. And so this evidence of backsliding has been clear to us for several years now, and really I think forms like the clearest backdrop of what we're seeing today with this foreign agent bill that seems to be moving ahead at alarmingly quick rate. I think another element that we have to be aware of too is a gradual deference to subservience by elements of the Georgian Dream political leadership to Russia. I think to a certain extent, there was always a kind of fear or anxiety or a sort of realistic approach to Russia in the sense that they wanted to maintain serviceable relations. They wanted to compartmentalize relations in a certain way to avoid the prospect of a conflict. Some of these things make sense. Some of these things were even advised by the United States, by our European allies. But over time, I think Shota put it well, there was an emergent deference and then evidence of subservience in certain respects as well. And I think that's what's on clearest display in this bill, which is very much a derivative of the Russian foreign agent law, as well as the Azerbaijani foreign agent law. And it it very much appears to be an effort by the Georgian Dream leadership to gut civil society, to gut the free media. And it's not just an attack on democracy here. I think it's also it also reflects a kind of excuse me, an institutional paranoia among some elements of the Georgian Dream leadership that not only have a personal issue or even a political issue with the statements or positions of some in civil society or the media, but actually they seem to believe that civil society and the media are illegitimate actors propped up by the West. And I think we don't need to go back very far to see elements well before this crisis of that kind of mindset on full display. Several years ago, I recall, seeing Georgian Dream leaders talk about the fear of a Euromaidan being repeated in Georgia, and this was a trope that was repeated, and this was kind of the trope of choice before the Second Front narrative became the dominant one in Georgia. And at the time, it was very much about the idea of a new color revolution taking place in Georgia. And it seemed to be based on this assumption that the West and a lot of the statements by Georgian Dream leadership has borne out this notion that the West is somehow trying to use its relationship with civil society and media organizations to overthrow the Georgian Dream undemocratically. And so there's I think a conflation between independent and even congressionally appropriated money and U.S. or Western vectored funds to this paranoid idea, this conspiracy theory that we're trying to overthrow them. And so that, I think, fed into this notion that the U.S. and Russia are not only equal in a lot of respects, but actually that, well, at least the Russians aren't trying to overthrow us. So it's kind of a feverish perspective, one based on paranoia and conspiracy, with no real evidence. But it's an issue that's been compounding over, I think, several years now, and now it's reached a head.
Thank you very much. Laura, for years, Georgian Dream's ascendancy has been buoyed in part because many Georgians saw that party as a better alternative to the long out of office Misha Saakashvili. Since most Georgians want democracy in a European future, might this latest move sharply reduce support for Georgian Dream or force them to back away from this legislation?
Thanks so much, John, and thanks for convening us here today to talk about this important issue. I'd like to start off and say I'm not in Georgia, so if Shota or others have thoughts, please, I'd like to hear the on-the-ground perspective. I was last there in December for about 10 days. But what I'm hearing from my contacts is that there really is a sense of urgency and anger that's palpable and fundamentally different than some of the other political crises we've seen over the past few years, and maybe on par or potentially bigger than the Gavrilov night protests in 2019, which I'm sure, as all of you will remember, led to a change in the electoral law. And as Michael said, folks really are picking up to this deference to Russia based on this law. And what I think we need to see, so first, I think contacts on the ground and throughout the country really do understand and link the law to Georgia's European future. And the Georgian people have not changed their course to remain steadfastly and strongly pro-West. We've even seen non-political or tacitly pro-government sports stars in the country coming out against the law. What remains to be seen really is, one, can the opposition work together? There isn't a particularly strong leader emerging yet to galvanize anger towards political change. But also, I think we need to look at, as Michael said and Shota referred to, the Georgian Dream has been getting more and more unpopular the longer they have held on to power. And there's many reasons for this. Michael nicely outlined the democratic backsliding, but also I think there's a lack of positive vision for the country. More of focus has been on scoring political points against the opposition, particularly the UNM. This is a political play that I think we've seen has been working for the Georgian Dream for quite a while, and the UNM readily engages in as well, but has also been getting quite tired as time goes on. We've seen this sharp increase in unfriendly rhetoric towards the EU and US. And additionally, votes for the Georgian Dream in the most recent past, not only, as Michael said, because of this sort of combining of state and party and conflating of state and party, but also because there hasn't been a particularly popular opposition party. The UNM, it has an immovable ceiling on support, and the rest of the opposition is rather small and fractured. And I think, unfortunately, many people still link the opposition directly with the UNM and fear that an opposition vote means that Saakashvili will return to power. So this dynamic is really important to understand on the ground. And then finally, I'd like to say it can't be overstated how palpable the large influx of Russians into Tbilisi is. Rents increasing dramatically, traffic is noticeably worse, costs at cafes and grocery stores have skyrocketed. Many of these things may or may not be because of the Russian influx, but it is generally attributed to that. You can hear Russian throughout the center of the city in ways that just did not happen previously. And despite improvements to the economy, I can imagine it's an uneasy feeling for most folks living with this change. They've been invaded as recently as 2008, and feeling how quickly Tbilisi can feel overcome or changed by migrants. So I think that the people understand and link the passing of the law to Georgia's Western orientation EU candidacy, and there's broad support among large swaths of the population for EU candidacy. So we're at a turning point in Georgia, and there's much more to watch in the coming days and weeks, and the Georgian Dream badly miscalculated. Thank you.
Laura, thank you. David, Shorta, Michael, and Laura have already anticipated the question I have for you, but I will ask it anyway because there's more to explore. Some observers link this legislation and authoritarian steps to Tbilisi's reluctance to support Ukraine in the face of Moscow's massive invasion. They see it as part of a strategy to improve relations with the Kremlin. To what extent is this a factor? And in any case, is this reluctance a political plus or minus for Georgian Dream?
Georgian Dream, I would say, John, clearly thinks this is advantageous. And I would say, as Laura just said, they have badly miscalculated. I would argue that this legislation is deliberately designed to try to undermine Georgia's pursuit of candidate status in the European Union. They don't want candidate status because that brings with it a lot of demands for transparency and accountability that Georgian Dream clearly is not interested in. Russia is not interested in seeing Georgia move closer toward the European Union, let alone NATO. And let's remember what Russia did to Ukraine in 2013 when Yanukovych was prepared to sign agreements with the EU. Now you have a case where the Georgian government and Georgian Dream, with Mr. Ivanishvili pulling the strings, is doing the Kremlin's bidding. So I think there's no doubt about it that Georgian Dream feels that its future is tied to Russia, not to the West, in contrast to the vast majority of the Georgian people who, according to opinion polls, remain very strongly pro-EU, pro-NATO, and pro-United States. I think it was Laura Michael who mentioned the attacks on the EU and the United States. We've never seen this before, coming from GD officials who pretend they're no longer part of the party, but even from government officials attacking the U.S. ambassador with utterly dangerous, reckless rhetoric. And so it seems that the Moscow has found its dream in Georgian Dream. And you have a party now in Georgia that clearly is towing the Kremlin's line. You see this in Georgia government's relationship with Ukraine, where Ukraine withdrew its ambassador in protest. The Georgian people remain strongly pro-Ukrainian. They understand what it's like to be invaded. But Georgian Dream seems to think that improving relations with Moscow while the relationship with Kiev deteriorates is in its interest. So I think there's no more guessing. There's no more questioning this. It is clear Georgian Dream is serving the interest of Russia, not of the Georgian people, and not of Georgia's aspirations to join the West.
And what does that mean for their ability to stay in power?
Well, that'll be up to the Georgian people to decide, but the international community certainly has a say in that. And I think we have been too passive. I understand that we have been distracted with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I've argued for quite a while that we have not paid enough attention to Georgia. And it's time for us to weigh in so that Georgian Dream officials understand they can't send their sons and daughters and wives and mistresses to the West and enjoy the West and what it has to offer, while at the same time trashing us and taking these kinds of steps that move Georgia closer to Russia. It's time for us to take some action in support of the vast majority of the Georgian people.
We'll come back to that a little bit later. Thank you. Okay, Dan, the State Department sharply condemned passage of this legislation and the crackdown on demonstrators. What impact, if any, will this have on U.S.-Georgian relations, taking into account both the administration and Congress?
We're the puppet master, and that we're orchestrating the demonstrations. We're not that good. We've never been capable of organizing that sort of mass protest. That's not what we were doing. David Kramer is right. The State Department and the US government generally was distracted and not focused on Georgia terribly much. That changed yesterday. It will have Georgia's attraction to the United States was a direct function of its relative success in transforming itself from a post-Soviet, corrupt, dysfunctional country, which is what it was before the Rose Revolution, into toward a European democracy. They made real progress. It's interesting to me that Saakashvili did a lot to help Georgia in his early years. But starting around 2007, he turned in an authoritarian direction. The police started beating up demonstrators. There were police abuses. Georgian society in those years turned against Saakashvili and his party, which is why Georgia Dream won the elections. Georgian society doesn't tolerate being beaten up by rulers that think that they can master the streets through clubs, through bashing people. So I think what happened yesterday was a sudden outpouring of national protest that had been growing, and suddenly it spilled over and crossed the line. Also, it's important to recognize that President Saakashvili issued a strong public statement identifying herself with the demonstrators. To my knowledge, that is the first time that she has broken with the government. She doesn't have a lot of power. It's a ceremonial position. She is, let us say, vulnerable, but she did it, which means that she is judging, I imagine she is judging the social mood. So yesterday was a very big deal. Putin will think that we are orchestrating it. We're not. And it is possible that Georgian society will turn against Georgian Dream in a big way. Georgian society is not passive. They have, Georgians have a record of standing up for themselves. The United States, US policy will follow this, as it should. We have already identified ourselves with the demonstrators, and we've come out and condemned both the government's tactics and the foreign agents law itself. I think that will have some effect, but it will not be dispositive. I think the Georgian society will welcome the fact that the United States stands with them and is now more active and explicit. But Georgians, I think David said this, and Laura said this, Georgians will decide the future of their country, and we need to help them.
Thank you. Yes, President Saakashvili's observations are very notable here. All right, Shota, do you think this legislation will stand and be implemented? And what will be the political consequences in Georgia of this crisis? It's basically following up on what Dan just said.
I think that this government is fully committed and determined to do whatever it takes to first adopt this legislation and then implement it. If this passes through all the procedures in the parliament and becomes a law, there is no doubt that it will be used and implemented, and it will be implemented exactly the same way it was implemented in the country of its origin, in Russia. And we do know what the effects and consequences of implementing that law was in Georgia. And I really do hope that the Georgian society will be in the position to resist all this much better than Russians did. At least this massive protest and outbreak in Tbilisi yesterday gives a lot of hope for that. And this was not the one standalone protest rally. It is going to continue. The people will gather today and protest again and again. So, yeah, well, there is no doubt that government wants to do it, will do anything that it takes to do it. It's now, it depends on now if they're able to win this fight with Georgian people or not. I hope not, but it is not going to be easy, John, because, once again, coming to this point, we are under the state capture. And we have to understand that the Georgian Dream Party has a full monopoly on all sources of power in the country. They fully control legislation branch, they fully control judiciary branch, they fully control executive branch, they have administrative resource, which is huge. The state is the biggest employer in Georgia. It employs more than 1/3 of the voter base in the country. So if some people in the West, in Europe, in the United States, sometimes ask me this question, if Georgian people are so pro-Western and if they want joining EU and NATO so much, how they can put up with such a government, which is dragging the country to Russia. And this is the answer to it. They don't, but there is no way to vote this government out in Georgia because of the system that is established there with the full capture, full state capture, and full monopoly of power by the Georgian Dream and Bidzina Ivanishvili there. So basically what was told to us today by the chairman of the Georgian Dream Party is very remarkable, and I will end on this. So the messaging has changed since yesterday in Tbilisi, and now we have heard the parallels with Maidan coming from the officials and members of parliament from the ruling party. They basically said that Russia invaded Ukraine because of Maidan, or Maidan led Russia to invading Ukraine. And the message was that if you will try to push us out of the government, actually you will get the war with Russia the way it is happening now in Ukraine. So basically, and to sum it up, what Georgian authorities are telling now Georgian people is that Russian armed forces are the guarantors of the power for them. And if they lose power, there will be war, which should mean that actually they should stay in power forever. And Russian armed forces and the threat of use of armed forces against Georgia should be the guarantee for them to maintain power in the country. So, which is of course unacceptable and disturbing.
Shota, that's absolutely astonishing. Thank you for bringing that out. Michael, I have the same question, though, for you that I just asked Shota. And I would just add before you answer, it strikes me that this legislation removes what the authorities see as perhaps one of the last, if not the last, bastion of opposition to themselves. They've methodically gone after the electoral law and so on. Now it's just this. But please, Michael, over to you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I agree with a lot of what Shota just said as well. It strikes me as being an effort to really pull the batteries out of the last independent, as you say, bastion of free thought and democratic expression in Georgia, and really trying to neutralize civil society and media that could serve as nodes of opposition, not just now and not just in the next election, but indefinitely. And so this is, I think the idea here is to really be able to neutralize them and to use that leverage in such a way to consolidate domestic political control indefinitely. I actually agree with Ambassador Freed that I think this is a ham-fisted approach, and this is one that historically has not worked well in Georgia, and ultimately the Georgian people won't put up with these sorts of things. It's also evident to me what Laura said, that right now the opposition is quite fractured, and unfortunately, there's a lot of differing and varying opinions about various political parties in the opposition among Georgian society. Even if Georgian society appears to be relatively unified about the propriety of this foreign agent bill and the direction that Georgian Dream is going, on any particular opposition party, there's quite a bit of disunity, and so that's actually something we're going to have to watch and see how it develops over time. With regard to the bill itself and its prospects, I agree with Shota that all the signals coming out of Georgian Dream right now appear to indicate, for the most part, that they're going to do whatever they can to push this through. But that said, it's also a few things that raise questions in my mind. One is the fact that there is a way in Parliament to accelerate the enactment of this bill into law, and to do it without going through 2 or more hearings in Parliament as normal procedure provides, but instead to do it through a single hearing. And in fact, this was something I think that has been done in this Parliament before, and was certainly done under Saakashvili's government for various legislation. And so what I don't completely understand is why there is an urgency to pass a first hearing of the bill, and even to move it up from Thursday to yesterday, to pass a first hearing of the bill, and then to send it to the Venice Commission, which is almost hilariously farcical as an act, and not just go and pass it in its entirety under accelerated procedures. So this is something that I kind of wonder. I also have heard from inside Parliament that there are MPs saying that they even now they don't expect it to pass somehow. There's also the question of President Saakashvili's veto, and she has pledged to veto it, although it's not a major obstacle to overcome for Parliament. So there are a number of factors that suggest that there's something else going on that's not entirely visible to me, and not entirely visible, I think, to many of us who are watching this even very closely. That there might be some kind of a benefit to ramming through the symbolic element of this legislation without enacting it quickly. That's not to say that they won't enact it. And in fact, like I said, there's a lot about their actions and their willingness to turn to repression and to anger their closest partners, and just the broader international reputational damage from this is potentially incalculable. Not to mention the possibility of just the way the West, perhaps ought to respond to the clear degradation of Georgian democracy. But there's also it's also not entirely intuitive the way that they're going about this if their goal is to pass it as quickly as possible. So, I want to say that only to say that there's, I think, interesting wrinkles to all of this. And there are intervening variables that aren't entirely clear to us. And if anyone else has knowledge or notions about what this might be, I think it would be an interesting discussion to have.
Thank you. Okay, Laura, there are news reports that Saakashvili is in poor health and prominent people are calling for his release for medical treatment outside of Georgia. Will this crisis persuade the Georgian government to reconsider its handling of Saakashvili and meet this request? And what is the political impact of this, if anything, on the crisis?
It's a good question, John, and I think that it follows sort of interestingly from the end of Michael's comments there on what this government's strategic moves are and what endgame they're playing, because sometimes it's rather hard to suss out. So I would argue that it is in the government's best interest, strategically prudent, and the right thing to do to allow Saakashvili to be treated abroad. He could get an unbiased medical opinion, whatever treatment is needed, and would also go a long way to sort of just diffuse the political theater around his imprisonment. And I think we can make the same argument about why he was imprisoned in the first place. I mean, there are a lot of on-ramps that could solve this situation, which is sort of it serves the purposes of being a political distraction while also being about, a real human and his need for medical treatment on the human level. But also it does distract from more pressing issues for the people of Georgia, this situation of Georgia's future in Europe, or something such as unemployment, poverty, lack of high quality healthcare. So we haven't seen the government having a great track record of taking prudent actions, even ones that would be in their own best interests to diffuse political tensions, say with the UNM. So I don't expect, as things stand now, a change in the government's handling of Saakashvili's health. But of course, many things are in play, as Michael has sort of alluded to. So I'd welcome other colleagues' thoughts as well.
Thank you. Okay, David, you've been a critic of Georgian backsliding on democracy for years and have talked about sanctions. What should U.S. policy be in these circumstances now?
I think we've had good reason to apply sanctions against a number of Georgian figures, starting with Mr. Ivanishvili and his family. I now would include the prime minister. I certainly would include Mr. Kobakidze, who continues to say idiotic things on a regular basis. And there are others as well. I would start putting a list together of the legislators who have voted for this foreign agent legislation and send them a signal today before there is a second and third reading that if they go ahead and approve this legislation, that they're going to be hit with sanctions. We've got to exercise our influence, and we have considerable influence. It is time to stop wondering, well, could we make the situation worse? It is getting worse on its own without our involvement. We have been far too passive. We have been far too willing to look the other way and dismissive of the attacks on the U.S. ambassador, on Senator Shaheen and others. This legislation, I would hope, would be the final straw that would push us in this direction. And let me be clear to Georgian listeners of this. I am not talking about sanctions against Georgia. I am not talking about sanctions against the Georgian people. I don't even support conditioning U.S. assistance on change in Georgia. I'm talking about targeted, personal, individual sanctions against those responsible for taking Georgia down the wrong path, not against the country as a whole. And I think it is over time for us to do so.
Presumably, you'd also be thinking about people who are associated with this legislation, especially both passage and implementation.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the names of the parliamentarians who vote for it. Remember, we put together a list of Russian Duma deputies and Federation Council members who voted for the.
Right. Okay. David, are you still with us? Maybe not. Dan, I have the same question for you while we wait for David.
Right. I think David is right at this phase of Georgia's dynamic. I think we ought to be looking at targeted individual sanctions against those passing the legislation and possibly those responsible for the treatment of Saakashvili. There is precedent for this sort of thing. David is right. I do not support sanctions against the Georgian economy or against Georgia as a whole, but I think sanctions against individuals is warranted at this stage.
Okay.
Simple answer, simple question.
Absolutely. Okay. David, you want to jump in? We lost you for a second.
No, I was, I think, making this. I picked up what Dan said. I mentioned the list of parliamentarians in Russia who voted for the illegal annexation of Crimea, and I would take a similar approach for those who vote for this legislation as well. One thing, real quick, John. One thing. Until you asked Laura about Saakashvili, I'm also wondering whether this legislation is designed to take attention off of his situation. There were more articles and more attention being brought about his terrible plight. And so now we're talking about the foreign agent legislation rather than talking about Misha. But the problem is Georgian Dream just takes us from one disaster to another.
Right. It will actually compound pressure on Georgia related to Saakashvili. There's no doubt about that. Shot, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I wanted to bring in this one point about the sanctions. In addition to what I said previously, I think that if there is something that can stop this legislation from being adopted and implemented, there is one remaining leverage, and this is the preemptive sanctions against the members of parliament that are explicitly linked and dependent on their access to the West because they themselves do not feel secure in Georgia. They store their money outside in the banks. They send their schools to their children to the school in the West. There is one deputy who voted for this legislation, and both of his children were born in the United States for the sake of getting citizenship for them. And these people are depriving the country and the society of Georgia of the right to enjoy its rightful strategic partnership with the United States and the European Union. So there is still a time, if now the United States comes out and clearly says that in the second and third hearings of this bill, whoever votes positively for this bill, there is this package of sanctions which automatically apply to those people and their families. And that's the only thing that can stop these people from making this choice, because it's the choice about their own asses. And they do not care about, the Western future of Georgia or the candidate status, just in opposite. They just want to stop it because they know that more West and more democracy means less power for them. And as in any authoritarian regime, the objective here is to maintain power, which directly excludes closer ties with the West, because if they implement these 12 recommendations that EU has put out as the precondition for granting candidate status, they will lose next elections. They will lose power immediately. So they're not interested in doing this. And the only thing that can stop them is this scale, their personal well-being and well-being of their families and the security of their families versus the ephemeric future of Georgia, which they do not actually care about. So preemptive sanctions announced today can really stop, the only thing that can stop this legislation from being adopted.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll take questions from the audience. We have an anonymous question which follows up on this issue, and it's really for David and Dan. Are any U.S. sanctions expected against the unofficial ruler of Georgia, Mr. Bina Ivanishvili? Yay or
I
nay?
don't know.
Okay.
I don't know, but yesterday's events were a game changer. I
Okay.
think the administration would not have acted before yesterday. I think they're going to reassess today.
Okay.
Well,
David?
today, starting today. It won't be a one-day process.
Okay. We have several questions from Jack Krupansky, but I'll just take one. It follows up on the point made by several about Russia's role. Is there any sense of whether Russia does or did have intentions to fully invade Georgia as they did with Ukraine? Were recent moves by the Georgian government designed to avoid such an invasion? And I would add to that, is it possible we could see an invasion if the scoundrels were chased out of power in Tbilisi? Anyone want to answer this?
I'll answer.
Michael?
Sure. I don't think there's any clear evidence that Russia intended to do a full-scale invasion of Georgia as they did in Ukraine. At least not right now. I think there's part of it is because I feel like they felt that they didn't have to, and I think the other aspect of this is they just do not have the personnel and material to engage in such a large scale operation while they're also having as much difficulty as they are in Ukraine. And I think that's also potentially the answer to your second question, that Russia is not in a position right now to engage in a large scale operation outside of Ukraine. Everything is being funneled into Ukraine to a point where they are also stripping other areas that they have previously regarded as being of high strategic concern, as being of powerful defensive value, and they're reorienting those forces into Ukraine. And a lot of my understanding about the garrisons in South Ossetia and Abkhazia has been that they have been emptied out and redeployed in a large way to Ukraine and backfilled with basically conscripts, recent mobilized conscripts. So there's not there doesn't seem to be a capability by Russia to do this. That doesn't mean that Georgia is in a position of strength. I think a realistic reading is that, well, Russia is going to be there, and after they're done with Ukraine, there is a fear that they could come for Georgia, depending on the circumstances. So this isn't a forever type of situation, but certainly I think right now Russia's in no position to be doing something like this. If I can also say a word about sanctions, I should say that I've personally been very strongly against any kind of discussion of sanctions in the past, because I felt like it sent the wrong message in certain ways, and fed into the conspiracizing and paranoia that I think has animated Ivanishvili and other Georgian Dream leaders' minds about the role of civil society. And I think in their mind, if the West is talking about sanctions, they must be the ones behind this mess with Credit Suisse, or this must be the reason why this civil society organization is politically active and trying to foment a color revolution. So in the past, I felt that this was not the right time, and also just kind of from a broader perspective. You look next door at the Aliyev and Pashayev families that have not been sanctioned, and probably are far more deserving, even compared to Ivanishvili. That said, we are at a turning point, right? This is a Rubicon across which Georgian Dream has decided to cross and throw themselves into Russia's embrace, and at the expense of Georgia's democracy, Georgian people's choices, and really the security of the region. And so I think it's absolutely understandable and absolutely appropriate for us to be looking at what kind of instruments are at our disposal, should they be necessary, to protect Georgia's democracy and protect the Georgian people's choice.
It seems that there's large agreement. David, you want to jump in?
Well, I agree with the second part of what Michael said, but as one of the loudest proponents of sanctions now for quite a while, let me just say, I wasn't just doing it for the sake of talking about sanctions. I was arguing for the imposition of sanctions. And if I think we had done so much earlier, we would not be where we are right now, which is at a very critical point. So I think it was appropriate to talk about it then. I think there was plenty of reason to talk about it then. State capture has been underway by Ivanishvili for years, and he is clearly taking the country down the wrong path. Going back to 2019, the whole Gavrilov incident, and since, I think have given us plenty of justification to move ahead with sanctions, and I regret that we haven't, but I certainly hope now we will.
Well, it seems like now there is almost unanimity on the panel, maybe we haven't heard from Laura on this, that sanctions may be appropriate. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Laura, but
No, I would agree with this, what Michael said, and now is the time. I guess I was more oriented with Michael as far as up until now. I see David's point, of course, that maybe it would have worked earlier, but I think now is the critical point, and now is the time that it needs to be looked at. I agree.
okay.
I agree with, I'm more in Michael's camp than David's, but it doesn't matter at this point. I think Georgian Dream has crossed a line, and I think we need to respond.
And a quick yes or no, are we going to actually see sanctions, do you think? Do you think that either the administration or Congress will act so that there will be some sanctions?
My guess is that the administration will wait to see how this plays out in the next day or so. The Georgian government could withdraw the bill. That's unlikely, but it's possible. So I think the administration will look hard before they take that step. Maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they should just move now. I understand the arguments for doing it. It's possible I'm wrong. I mean, the sanctions people could just decide to move quickly.
Right.
But if I had to guess, I would say that they'll wait 48 hours to see how this plays out. But they may publicly hint at sanctions.
Right. A strong private message would be well in order.
Yeah, that's in their place. That's what I would do.
Yeah, me too. Okay, we have a question from Ambassador Bill Courtney, which is sort of around what we've been discussing. He wants to know, to what extent does the backsliding in recent years reflect Bina's influence? Or are there other sentiments in Georgia that are contributing to this? Laura, you want to give a shot at that?
Well, maybe just one sentence. There is nothing on strategic or operational or even tactical level that really matters in that country that is decided without the consent of Bidzina Ivanishvili. So I would say it is absolutely logical to say that yes, he is the primary responsible for the backsliding, but the tools that he uses for this in legislative, in executive and judiciary branches are as responsible for this backsliding as the one who has ordered it and masterminded it, in my understanding.
Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, thanks, Shota. So I agree. I agree with the fundamentals of what Shota said. If you look at Ivanishvili's percentage of his wealth to Georgian GDP, you can already see a concerning outsized influence. And I do agree, he is directing the actions of the government. And there are many people that are helping to practically and tactically implement those as with the situation of the institutions as it is on the ground now. So it is being directed, but with help from those who are enabling this behavior and the institutions which were not set up that way to stand on their own thus far. This sort of slowly getting more and more power, concentrating more and more power in the hands of Georgian Dream.
Michael, before I turn to you, there's another question here which contributes to this, or may contribute to this conversation. It's an epistemological question from an anonymous attendee, which kind of challenging the views that we're hearing expressed by all of us. How much do the pro-Western views of the Georgian public reflect a divergence between urban and rural communities in Georgia, suggesting that we the Westerners are listening to the urbanites, and maybe the rural Georgians have a different view? So, Michael, now the floor is yours, but I think others may want to comment on that as well.
No, that's an interesting question and a good one. I don't have the polls in front of me, so I can't like crack tabs. But from my my recollection, fairly reliably, the polling in the Caucasus Resource Center's Caucasus Barometer, for example, tends to show fairly strong support also in rural areas. There is a rural-urban divide for sure, but it's not this kind of yawning gap where rural localities are actually very strongly pro-Russia and anti-West. I think there is more of a critical mass in those areas for some of the more socially conservative perspectives and also some anti-West elements, but it's not as striking as maybe one might think based on kind of the top line reputation of the way these things shake out. I also want to comment on what Laura said. I think she made a really good point about. Obviously, Ivanishvili is the principal agent here, but he's also surrounded himself with people who have quite clearly and gladly and maybe even enthusiastically done his bidding in various respects. And I think Kobachidze is really the face of this in a lot of ways. Garabashvili to an extent as well. And I think to Laura's point, we have also seen a disaggregation within Georgian institutions around regime preservation, and also this idea of what the way it faces the world and the West, right? So, we in government, we have our interactions with the MFA quite regularly, and the MFA has been, for the most part, fairly wonderful to work with. And they say all the right things at the UNGA, at OSCE, at Council of Europe, right? And they've been quite strongly supportive of Ukraine, but they're also evidently not in the driver's seat. Secretary of Defense Austin met with Defense Minister Burchaladze just a few weeks ago, and there were, it was a good exchange between, two counterparts, and but it wasn't reflective of the actual direction of where the government was going. And what we can see is that, particularly in the Interior Ministry, in security services, and pockets in other ministries that really have been kind of the primary apparatus for this state capture, for Georgian Dream's movement towards Russia. If we look over the past few years, we all know that that Georgia is riven with Russian intelligence operatives and bad actors. And where have the arrests been? Where's the CIA activity? Where's the work being done to counter Russian information and intelligence operations? There hasn't been any. So it's, yeah.
Thank you. We're already at time, but I want to give Shota a 1 minute last word.
Well, yeah, I was checking the Q&A box, and there was this question directed to me directly. So I will maybe finish on this point.
Okay.
That we really need to understand that the Georgian government, in absolute copy-paste way, has unleashed the brainwashing and indoctrination, propaganda and disinformation campaigns against the citizens of Georgia on a national scale. For years, this narrative that West either is not realistic or feasible partner for Georgia, or it's evil and it's trying to destroy Georgian values. This has been sold consistently to the Georgian society for last years. And it was in addition and as an extension to Russian disinformation campaigns, but managed by the Georgian government. So now, if there is any divide between the urban and rural parts of Georgian society, it is because that the rural part of Georgia is much more vulnerable to this kind of conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns, which are skillfully masterminded and implemented. But despite this, please keep in mind that according to any credible poll that has been conducted in this country in recent years, on a national scale, nationwide, Georgians, more than 80% of Georgians still, despite this massive campaigns from Russia and from the Georgian government, still support Western orientation. So I would not really put a lot of emphasis and stress now on this particular aspect of information ecosystem in Georgia.
Laura, I see your fingers up. We're 2 minutes over. 30 seconds.
I just wanted to reframe the rural-urban divide as more of a political class, non-political class divide, because I think many rural Georgians have moved to Tbilisi because that is where you can get a job. And so it's less, and we hear this political class discourse all the time, but that's not reflective of Tbilisi as a whole. And so I just would reframe the debate that way.
Okay. Thank you all for this very strong conversation. We may be doing more on Georgia as events dictate. And thanks everyone for tuning in.